in PPP with the government of India. Ladies and gentlemen, with expertise in contract management, project financing, and bridge construction, he has led significant projects like the Kazigund-Baramulla rail link and Dhalkut port privatization. He holds a PhD degree in PPP from Noida International University and executive study program from Harvard Business School. Last but not the least, our distinguished member of the panel, Ms. Jyoti Bisbey, executive board member and advisor on green infrastructures and PPP. Ms. Jyoti Bisbey is a global expert with more than 20 years of experience leading green and resilient infrastructure finance and PPPs in developing nations. She also holds an executive diploma from Harvard University, MBA from George Washington University, and mathematics degree from St. Stephen's College in Delhi of India. Ladies and gentlemen, as I invite my distinguished panelists on the dais to get things set here. I still can see people pouring in. We request all of you to kindly find your seats as quickly as possible. Kindly accept to the distinguished members, to all of you, kindly accept a warm welcome one more time. Feeling really glad and spirited to steer you to the penultimate engagement under this umbrella of the summit, ladies and gentlemen. And pleased to have been graced by our distinguished dignitaries and prominent investors here and the members in the audience. This is a panel that is, again, I say penultimate panel connecting to the closing ceremony and themed at leveraging PPP and infrastructure and services. So we are discussing a very fashionable topic, why Nepal has come a long, long way from the classic approach of PPP and is now carrying it as a tool for socio-economic development, the much needed socio-economic development. Now, with this intense need of development, especially related to infrastructure, the resources, prospects that we have, the aspirations of the young population, and the shrinking global landscape that allows for heightened interaction, mobility of knowledge in all sorts, PPP stands as a promising tool to spearhead this founding sector of overall development. So we cannot be more happy as we look forward to this very fundamental issue that we'll be discussing herein. To set the tone and direction for the rest of the expert deliberation here, may I now invite to the podium for a presentation that, again, as I said, sets the tone and direction for this deliberation. Okay, before I invite our presentator, may I invite our member in one more member in the distinguished panel, Mr. Dushyant Thakur, Deputy Executive Director, World Association of Investment Promotion Agency. Such a pleasure, sir, to have you join us here. So getting back to our regular schedule, ladies and gentlemen, first a presentation that directs or gives food or lays the tone for the deliberations. Mr. Mark Giblett, Senior Infrastructure Finance Specialist at the World Bank Group. He's a Senior Infrastructure Finance Specialist at the World Bank Group's JPG unit and has 25+ years of structured finance experience in infrastructure and project finance. He advises governments on enhancing legal and regulatory frameworks for private sector investment in infrastructure. He holds a BA in economics from the University of Exeter and an MBA in international business from the University of British Columbia. My pleasure and privilege, ladies and gentlemen, to invite to the podium our presenter, Mr. Mark Giblett.
On, shouldn't I? There we go. Good afternoon, everybody. As kindly introduced, my name is Mark Giblett, and I'm a Senior Infrastructure Finance Specialist at the World Bank, and it gives me great pleasure to be here today to be part of this important session on PPPs. So I've been asked by the organisers to basically set the context for the panel discussion on PPPs, but I've only been given 10 minutes. And for those who know me, it usually takes 10 minutes to me to introduce myself. But, you know, based on the sessions we had yesterday, it seems like time is a bit of an elastic concept at this summit. So maybe 10 minutes actually means 20 minutes. But don't worry, MC, I'm going to try and keep these slides to 10 minutes. So I first of all really want to set the macroeconomic context, because obviously the economic context is very important from a private sector investor's perspective, whether it's domestic investors or it's overseas investors. So the good news is that essentially Nepal is slowly beginning to improve its economy post-COVID. Economic growth is expected to rebound to around about 3.3% in FY24 from 1.9% in FY23. And this is mainly being due on the back of an increase in services, particularly tourism, so that's accommodation and food, and also an increase in industrial output, which is essentially higher hydropower generation. And moving forward to 25-26, I think the consensus is that basically growth is going to average around about 5%. In terms of the half-year current account balance, you will note that it's actually moved from a negative 0.7% in H1 FY23 to a surplus of 2.7% in H1 FY24. So this is the first time that Nepal has benefited from a surplus in 8 years. And this has mostly been driven by remittances, that's money coming in from overseas workers, and the narrowing of the trade deficit. Over the same period, the fiscal deficit has fallen from 1.4% to 0.4%, and this has been mainly due to a reduction in government spending, and inflation has come down from well over 8% to around about 6.5%. But inflation is proving a little bit sticky at the moment in terms of coming down further. There's been quite a significant decline in poverty. This was mentioned yesterday, from 25% in 2011 to around about 3.6% in FY23, and that's mostly been driven by migration and remittances, and of course those two are to some extent linked. Inequality, defined by the Gini index, has continued its downward trajectory, and in the banking sector is still fairly profitable and fairly stable, but non-performing loans are actually beginning to creep up in the commercial banking side, so obviously that needs to be monitored carefully moving forwards. In terms of the public debt position, Nepal is actually doing quite well relative to many of its peers. Public debt to GDP is just under 40%, and you can see from the chart below that essentially there was a sharp increase from FY20 to FY21, and of course that was mainly due to COVID, but essentially public debt remains fairly sustainable. And this is basically due to the fact that a large chunk of this debt is essentially being lent on concessional terms, so it means long tenors at relatively low interest rates, and successive governments have actually been fairly prudent in terms of fiscal management. Unfortunately, Nepal, like a lot of other countries, are going to be facing some headwinds, so there are some downward risks to this relatively rosy economic scenario. So obviously increasing geopolitical uncertainties could cause an upsurge in commodity prices, and this is obviously going to affect the Nepalese economy through an increase in import prices. There could be a slowdown in growth in partner countries, so this could affect remittances and tourist revenues, and that's quite important because basically remittances and tourism have been the two main engines or drivers of economic growth over the last few years. Persistent inflation expectations could dampen consumer demand, so this essentially means that individuals don't believe prices are coming down, so demand higher wages, which keeps prices up. And of course, unfortunately, as you all know, Nepal is very exposed to climate change and natural disasters, so there could be some shocks coming from that angle. And finally, frequent political changes and uncertainties in terms of policies, some are not friends to FDI and private sector investment. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a context of where the economy is now, but where does Nepal have aspirations to grow to? What are its objectives? Well, first of all, we heard this yesterday, that essentially by 2030, Nepal wants to become a middle-income country and wants to achieve the SDGs. By 2043, it wants to become a high-income status, and essentially by 2045, it wants to basically get net zero emissions in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. But of course, to do that, it's going to require a lot of investment into infrastructure, and estimates vary from institution to institution, but I think the general consensus is that at least 10% per year of GDP has really got to be put into investment from 2020 through to 2030 in order to meet those 2030 objectives. But at the moment it seems that infrastructure investment as a percentage of GDP is averaging around about 4%. So of course there's a bit of a gap at the moment. So how is Nepal approaching its economic development plan to try and reflect the importance of infrastructure investment? Well, it's centering its infrastructure development plans around the GRID framework. And for those who are not familiar with GRID, I'm sure you are by now, but GRID stands for Green, Resilient and Inclusive Development. And some of you may recall back in 2021, Nepal was the first country to publicly announce that it was going to basically tie its growth strategy to this GRID framework. That was in the so-called Kathmandu Declaration. So as a result of this, basically the government and various development partners have coalesced around this GRID framework and are trying to bring investment into various GRID-related sectors. And I've listed some of them down there. We have renewable energy, sustainable tourism, green transport and resilient roads, and integrated solid waste management, to name a few. But money coming in from the development partners and money coming in from the government alone is going to be insufficient, essentially, to meet the infrastructure investment needs in these sectors. So Nepal has got to start mobilizing more money from the private sector, particularly through PPPs. And the government itself has recognized this, the importance of PPPs, in the 15th Development Plan. And of course, the 16th Development Plan is going to be released, I understand, in the summer. So this is really based on the 15th Development Plan. But in that plan, the government forecast or estimated that it needed to mobilize around about $6 billion of money from PPPs into infrastructure over the 5-year life of the plan, which essentially goes from 2019 through to 2024. But as you'll see from this slide and the charts here, Nepal hasn't been too successful in trying to meet those targets. So this data is taken from the PPI database. PPI stands for Private Participation Infrastructure. It is a database that's managed by the World Bank. It's publicly accessible, so you just put PPI database into your search engine and you can get access to that data. And it essentially tracks private sector investment into infrastructure in emerging market and developing economies. So this data is from Nepal, is from 2013 through to 2023, first half, so essentially 10 years. So based on the reported data in the PPI database, you can see that there are basically 26 projects mobilizing about $3.5 billion of capital. So that's actually quite a considerable sum of money, but that's $3.5 billion over 10 years compared with the $6 billion that Nepal was trying to target over 5 years of the 15th plan. But I think the most important fact to draw from this chart is that by far the greatest majority of investment has really gone into the electricity sector, which is really the hydro sector, with 24 out of 26 projects. So essentially that means that Nepal hasn't been too successful in trying to mobilize private sector investment through PPPs into other sectors. So why has that been the case? Well, I put some issues down here. These are not in order of any importance. But first of all, Nepal generally lacks the financial resources to invest the amount of money it needs into infrastructure. This is both from the public spending side, but also from the PPP side. So Nepal doesn't really have sufficient funding to prepare feasibility studies, to provide viability gap funding, to provide linking infrastructure if that's required, and also availability payments if that's the chosen contractual structure for the PPP. Like many other countries that are starting doing PPPs, there is a lack of understanding and willingness to do PPPs. PPPs are regarded as complex, time-consuming, and also, many ministries and agencies have spent decades procuring infrastructure through traditional procurement, and human nature being what it is, people tend to lean towards what they're used to, not new things such as PPPs. There is weak legal and policy arrangements for PPPs, lack of policy stability in some cases. There's delays in approval processes, particularly in terms of land. There's sometimes a lack of coordination between the stakeholders. And of course, from offshore investors, there's FX risk in terms of depreciation. And in terms of contractual structures, there are some issues around the sharing of costs, benefits and risks. And I agree with all of these constraints, and these are issues that need to be addressed, but you'll be interested to hear that it wasn't me that came up with these list of issues. These were actually extracted from the 15th Development Plan prepared by the government itself. So the good news is that the government actually recognizes itself what the issues are. And of course that's important because you can't deal with the issues unless you know what the issues are. So coming to my last slide, the MC will be very pleased to hear, what initiatives have been taken by the government to try and address some of these issues? Well, first of all, in 2019, you had the PPP and Investment Act that was passed, and that was essentially passed to try and set the legal framework for PPPs and FDI. And we heard from the Honourable CEO of IBN yesterday that the President has approved an amendment to that Act. In 2022, IBN, which is essentially the nodal agency for PPPs in Nepal, prepared the Project Bank guidelines. That was with the help of the World Bank and various other development partners, and I think you've got a copy of the Project Bank guidelines in your goodie bag. So essentially, these guidelines set a very robust framework for implementing agencies to identify and screen PPP projects. And of course, there's been lots of capacity building from various development partners, not just the World Bank, including the CLDP. So we have capacity building at the IBN level, ministries and agencies at the federal and provincial level. So this is all around project identification, project screening, climate risk screening, fiscal risk management, and project management. So finally, if you just look at the chart on the right of the slide, this has been extracted from the Benchmarking Infrastructure Development Report that was issued by the World Bank very recently. And as the name suggests, it focuses very much on the benchmarking of infrastructure across countries, focusing on PPPs. So essentially it looks at how robust a country's institutional, legal and regulatory framework is for doing PPPs. And it does this benchmarking across 4 parameters: project preparation, project procurement, contract management, and how well a government handles unsolicited proposals. So you can see Nepal's scores in the middle, and the scores are reflected in a blue band around the outside, and the global average is in the green band, the thinner green band, around the outside of the circle. So you can see essentially Nepal is not doing too badly. It is performing there or thereabouts in terms of the global averages, but of course much more can be done in terms of strengthening the enabling environment for PPPs. Much more can be done to improve capacity building at the federal and provincial level, but much more importantly, more can be done to try and mobilize private sector investment through PPPs into sectors outside of the electricity sector. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. Hopefully I've kept within the 10 minutes, and I'm sure some of these issues and questions I've raised will be dealt with by the panel. So with that, let me hand back to the MC. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for setting the tone for the deliberations just right, because due to join us in the panel. Said that, I turn to the session moderator. We have around less than 60 minutes for the deliberation, and that includes the statements from the Honorable Deputy Prime Minister, because this is connecting to the closing ceremony wherein we are expecting some high dignitaries. So without further ado, my pleasure to hand it over to the session moderator. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sovna. Namaste and good afternoon, Honorable Deputy Prime Minister and Home Minister Lamichhane, Honorable Secretary Phanindra Gautam, Ministry of Law, Justice and Parliamentary Affairs, Chief Executive Officer Sushil Bhatta of the Office of the Investment Board of Nepal. So thank you so much to you all for being here today. Just a reminder before we get started on the panel discussion. It turns out that you can actually hear quite a little bit from the audience if the audience is speaking or making certain noises, and it turns out that the speakers are turned more towards you all than it is towards the stage, so it may be difficult to hear. So I just ask that if you need to speak with your neighbor or take a phone call, that you please do so outside. So thank you very much. So it's been very encouraging to hear about the government of Nepal's commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as graduating to middle-income country status fairly soon. Investing in critical infrastructure is going to be necessary to achieve these goals, as Mark just discussed. However, in Nepal and in most countries all around the world, it's almost impossible to do just with the public sector. And so encouraging private sector engagement and investment is absolutely critical. Mark also discussed that a bit. So that's where PPPs come into the picture. So with that, I'd like to direct my first question to CEO Partha. The government of Nepal, and specifically the Office of the Investment Board of Nepal, has worked tirelessly to design a public-private partnership policy framework to draw foreign investors. Could you please discuss some elements and characteristics of Nepal's framework that may be attractive to foreign investors? And what does Nepal's framework specifically have to offer to investors?
Thank you, Grishmaji, for the question. In retrospect to the policy framework that Nepal has for PPP, well, we are guided by Public-Private Partnership and Investment Act 2019. But prior to that, we started the very business with the act that was promulgated long back in 2011, Investment Board Act. And how we evaluated is we formulated PPP policy in 2015, and which is now under review, and then we'll go for revision also. But as far as the existing provision that the PPP-IA Act has given, we basically, it's all about risk and return, as rightly said by Mark, and also about managing risk. So on that retrospect, management of risk is most important. The spirit when you go carry along with the act is management of risk, and then subsequently is to the extent possible the de-risking has to be done. And as per the act, the PPP project can be developed only upon allocation of risk that we offload to the private sector. So we are on traditional and conventional mode of PPP that we are exercising, but we can, through this summit, position that we have been successful exercising that model, where government comes forward and takes obligations of managing land, issue relating to land acquisitions, and at the same time giving statutory clearances of tree cutting or maybe lease arrangements of government land or private land acquisition. We do facilitation. But we are at the same time well aware of how important it is for us to undertake the obligations that we have undertaken. That needs to be fulfilled from our side, because that otherwise eventually would lead to eventually delays of the project. So it is very important for project to be accomplished within or before stipulated timeline, because there is matter pertaining to benefit sharing also there. So there are benefits that the government gets, direct benefits and indirect benefits also. The project coming into logical conclusion will generate one sort of vibrancy because we get forward linkage benefits. But during construction regime, it creates a lot of things, construction materials, consumption, creation of decent job, employment opportunities and all that. So beside to name, in order to ensure that projects are commercially viable, it is high time, because Mark's presentation, if you refer to incentivize climate actions or even green projects, the grid needs to be operationalized as early as possible. And international financing institution can play a very instrumental role in bridging the infrastructure gap in developing countries through